Welcome to the How to Be Awesome at Your Job podcast, the show where brilliant professionals share how to sharpen the universal skills required to flourish at work. Enjoy more career fun, wins, meaning, and money with your host, Pete Makaitis.
Hello and welcome to episode 910 with Chuck Wisner. If you would like to have more powerful conversations that are productive and effective and even change the way you think and feel about yourself and what you're capable of, Chuck has got a boatload of good wisdom to do just that. So you'll learn 1, the 4 universal types of conversations and why they matter. 2, how to stop your stories from limiting you. And 3, the fundamental pattern for better collaboration. So if you want to check out the show notes or the transcript or the links to items that we've referenced, please drop on by awesomeatyourjob.com/EP910 as in episode 910. Get it? That's the story there. And here's a story about Chuck. Chuck Wisner is the president of Wisner Consulting. His client list includes companies such as Google, Rivian, Apple, Tesla, Harvard Business School, Ford, and Chrysler. Wisner was a senior affiliated mediator with the Harvard Mediation Program and was among the first to be certified through the Mastering the Art of Professional Coaching program at Newfield Institute. He was also a specialist in organizational learning and leadership as an affiliate with MIT's Center for Organizational Learning. So huge thanks to Chuck for sharing his wisdom with us, and huge thanks to our sponsor, Dash Hudson. If you do marketing work or manage social media, it can feel mighty overwhelming navigating the ever-changing social media landscape. Great marketers need access to the latest insights and best practices to thrive without spending eons just to keep up with what's going on with the newest everything. And a great resource for that is Dash Hudson's Social Media Trends Report. Dash Hudson is a social media management platform that delivers sophisticated insights and workflow tools. Dash Hudson is trusted by thousands of brands like United Airlines, Rare Beauty, and Procter & Gamble. It keeps you in the know and saves you time. And now they are proud to offer their highly anticipated Social Media Trends Report. This report unveils the social media industry's leading trends and insights. And I think my fave was that creators who post on behalf of a brand on Instagram had 16 times the engagement rates as compared to those brands who directly natively engage on Instagram. Oh, so find those influencers apparently instead of going direct to get 16 times the impact. That's just good to know. You can learn that and a whole lot more by downloading their trends report and signing up for a free 14-day trial of Dash Hudson today at dashhudson.com/podcast. That's spelled DASHHUDSON.com/podcast. Now, here's Chuck. Chuck, welcome to How to Be Awesome at Your Job.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, I'm excited to get into your wisdom, hearing some tidbits you've collected in your book, The Art of Conscious Conversations, Transforming How We Talk, Listen, and Interact. But first, I need to hear about you and rock and roll.
Oh, boy.
What's the story here?
Oh, boy. Well, when I was very young, I think I was very fidgety and probably a bit of ADD. And my mother took me to school when I was 7 and said, this boy needs drum lessons, because I was always sitting around doing that sort of thing. So literally I was trained professional classically as a percussionist from 7 years old. So, and then I played all through high school. I was in jazz bands, rock and roll bands. I ended up being in the Air Force National Guard band because I played timpani. So that was my first career. And to this day, I still play in a rock and roll band, maybe better categorized as a garage band, but 4 or 5 of us have been playing together for over 30 years. So we have a great, great time together.
That is impressive. I'm curious, with this rock and roll band or garage band, any noteworthy performances or encounters you had in your gigs and such?
Well, I had fun when I was a lot younger, when I was 18, 19, because the rock and roll band I was in, we cut records and we were on national TV, some small little thing in Ohio. But now the fun that we have is once or twice a year, we invite hundreds of our best friends and we just have a big dance party.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So that's how we do it now.
That's fun.
Yeah, it's really fun.
That's fun. Well, now I'm curious to hear your book, The Art of Conscious Conversations. Boy, you've talked to a lot of people about this sort of thing and collected a lot of wisdom. I'm curious, any particularly surprising or extra fascinating or counterintuitive discoveries you've made about us humans and conversation and being conscious over your years?
There's several important facets that show up everywhere, whether I'm working with a family, a couple, a leadership, a team. And the biggest one that often pops up, there's two. One is authority issues. And we live in hierarchies, whether we like it or not. Families have a hierarchy, which is a natural hierarchy, and business has a structured, man-made hierarchy. And the issues of power just resonate in every conversation, from leadership to parenting. And so that is something that we have to pay special attention to. And the other piece is that we grow up adopting standards. Now, standards is a catch-all phrase to mean our morals, what's right or wrong, what we like, what we don't like, what's good, what's bad, what's fair, what's unfair. But we grow up adopting standards from our families and our cultures and believe that they're the truth or believe that they're the right thing. And that gets us in a lot of trouble because often our quarrels are because I think I should measure success this way and you should measure success that way.
Okay.
Those two are really big. The other big one is the first conversation in my book is the storytelling conversation. And if we just look at the state of the world right now, we live in stories. And like Yuval Harari's book, A Brief History of Humankind, we evolved learning to tell stories and we adopt stories. And that's how we create our culture and our society. The trouble is that when we're attached to our stories, we believe them as the truth and we'll do anything to defend them. And that's a very common theme.
Well, that feels like a master key to humanity and life itself.
Yeah.
Chuck, not to overhype it, but give us an example of that in practice.
Okay. Well, let's say in business, I have two actually very similar situations from different companies where the legal department and the finance department weren't even talking to one another. And two departments that probably should be working hand in hand. They had different stories about what was going on in the company, and they were applying different standards to what was going on in the company. And they were so attached to their story that the other side was the enemy. And it took bringing them into a room and just deconstructing these stories where the finance department could see how the legal guys and gals were thinking and vice versa. And, within a couple of days of working hard and playing hard together, those stories started to not be so held so hard. And I think of it like if we have a story that we really believe in, that we think it's the truth, it's like having a fist. We're telling our story like, this is the truth. This is the way it has to be. So anyway, in that situation, deconstruct the stories, get them to hear each other, and things start changing rapidly when we start building bridges, right? And not in business life, but in personal life, even with friends, we have stories and we judge people based on our stories. And if we believe our story is the only one, then our criticisms and our judgments really sting and they hurt us and they hurt the other person. So their stories abound everywhere and they cause a lot of the friction and stress that we experience.
Hey, could you give us an example of an articulation of a story? It may be, if it's not too intricately detailed with the finance and legal, just so we can see how that plays out. Like, hey, here's the finance story and here's the legal story. See how these implications unfold trickily?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can do that. And then I could give you a very personal example too of how powerful it is, which might resonate a little more. I grew up with a very redneck grandfather in Pennsylvania, near Philadelphia. And I had 3 older sisters. And when I showed emotion, or when I didn't want to skin the deer because I didn't like it, because it made me sick, or when I got hurt and cried, the message that I always got was, you're not a big enough man. Be a bigger man. Stop that. Now, that's not a new story. A lot of men my age have experienced that. But what I realized was that story I adopted as a child because my grandfather, to some degree my father, but my grandfather I gave his voice authority. I gave his voice power. So I believed I wasn't a big enough man. It wasn't until I was 30 that I was able to bust that story. And when I busted that story, it was like such a dramatic change because up to that point, I actually walked into a room. I was a successful architect. I had a family, but I would walk into a room of men and feel smaller than, or not as competent as, or whatever. However, not a big enough man would show up. And when I busted that story, it was like transformational.
Okay. And so then that's when you enter those rooms, you experience those feelings, which are not pleasant, and which I guess in turn likely reduced your confidence, your willingness to take risks, take on projects, initiatives, and what are some of the other implications of that story going on for you?
Well, I think back then was it, whether we know it or not, that kind of self-limiting belief, other people read that. So it affects how other people see you and then how other people treat you. And in turn, the stories they have about you. So it does have an effect where it's literally how you're showing up in the world. And you may think you're hiding it, but it's actually quite obvious to people that are paying attention. They notice it, and that affects our interaction.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And how did you break free, bust loose of that story?
All right. Well, when I left architecture to study the ontology of language as a story of why that happened. But once I was in those studies, inside of there's in the world of philosophy of language and the studies of language, there's a term called master assessments. And so if you're looking at what master assessments do you have of yourself, good, bad, ones that serve you, ones that don't serve you. This happened to be a master assessment I had in my brain, in my mind, that didn't serve me. So using the ideas around language and the 5 speech acts and deconstructing language, I was able to sort of take it apart. And when I say deconstruct, it's like, wait a minute, what are the facts here? Well, I'm 6 feet tall. I'm happily married. I have 2 young kids. I'm an architect. And all those facts didn't line up with the story. And so as I keep looking into it and saying, so what were the standards that my grandfather was applying? Well, he was a redneck, and that was his story about what a man was. And I happened to be the recipient of that standard that I adopted unconsciously. And so that's what I did. I just sort of like took it apart piece by piece until it was, aha, this isn't true. This isn't who I am. And the next morning when I went in to have coffee with the president of the firm I was working at, we were good buddies. It was the first time I was able to stand there, have a coffee. I said to myself, I said, holy mackerel, I am taller than Bill. And literally, that was like a moment I was shocked. I was like, all this time I saw myself smaller than. That's how sort of like embodied this stuff gets.
Oh, that's powerful. Thank you. Wow. Okay, story. Well, we're probably going to talk more about that, but maybe we could zoom out a smidge.
Yeah.
In terms of the art of conscious conversations, it sounds like we've got one major thread in terms of story there. Could you maybe zoom out and tell us what's sort of the big idea, main message, core thesis? And
okay.
And what do we mean by a conscious conversation?
The core idea is we grow up learning to converse, talk, listen, interact through our culture, through our families, through our education. And we adopt all of the norms from those different domains. But we're never really taught to understand how conversations work or the DNA of conversations. And so through my work and my consulting and my teaching in the last 30 years, I kept seeing clients' eyes light up or have aha moments when they realized that their stories weren't the truth, or they didn't know how to collaborate, or they were abusing power or whatever, or they adopted standards that don't serve them. And then they would say, well, where can I read about this? There's amazing information out there, but it's all scattered. And so I decided to try to take some esoteric work and some work that's been done by Peter Senge and Fred Kaufman. But I decided to sort of compile it into a book that said, look, here's the fundamentals of conversations. And instead of being unconscious of how they work, let's have some distinctions so we can become much more aware and make much better decisions about the conversations we're in and how we want to participate in them. And so one metaphor I like is like fish in water. There's fish swimming, and this old fish swims by some 2 young fish, and he says to them, hey, fellers, how's the water today? And they just ignore him and they keep swimming. And then they stop, and one of the young fish says to the other, hey, what's water? Right. And so it's like they aren't even aware they're in water. We, a lot of the times, aren't aware that we're in conversations or aware or conscious of our words and our interactions in the way that as much as we could be. So the book presents some distinctions that says, okay, let's think about it. Let's have some new ways to look at it and see it and experience it.
Okay. So when you talk about having an awareness that we're in a conversation, you have, in fact, segmented the conversations into 4 universal types. Can you share what those are? We'll just start there. Can you share definitionally, what are these 4 types?
Yeah. So I'll do a very high level, right? So storytelling, and the byline with storytelling is your stories are not the truth. The second conversation is collaboration. And the byline there is seek to understand, ask questions to understand and absorb other perspectives, and absorb being the key word there. The third one is a creative conversation, which is about trusting your intuition and learning to balance your left brain and your right brain and co-create with others. And the last conversation is commitment conversations. And that conversation is the action conversation. That's when you and I agree to do a podcast together. That's when my wife and I agree who's going to pick up the kids. That's when a team decides who's going to write the strategy for the board meeting. So that action conversation is everywhere, and we don't understand it, and we do it in a very sloppy way. Those are the 4.
Okay. Well, so we talked a bit about storytelling. Is there more you want to say there in terms of how do we get to become consciously aware of our stories and the actual truth?
Yeah. So in conversation, we all come to every conversation with a story, with our story about what's happening. There might be some facts. It might be all of our opinion. It might just be a bunch of assessments or judgments. We humans all have patterns of interacting. And I like to use the word patterns because it allows us a little bit to step away from, say, a behavior or a habit that we have and look at it neutrally. Say, wow, what's my pattern around storytelling? What's my pattern of when I enter a meeting, how I'm telling my story or what energy I'm bringing to that. And so the first thing is becoming aware that your stories aren't the truth. And then secondly, how are you presenting yourself and how are you presenting your stories? Because we all have patterns around judging, around being perfectionists, around being critical of other people's ways of doing things. And so becoming aware means we can have a look, and instead of maybe a reaction or a pattern of defensiveness, we can change that. So I mentioned earlier about a fist. One analogy I like is if we have a story and we believe it's absolutely true and it's a really important topic that we care about, it could be business, it could be out of business, it could be political, it could be not political. But if we believe that we have the answer and we are right, we are basically telling our story with a closed fist. And under every story, there are emotions, and facts, and standards, and power issues, and desires that are really what's the root of our story. So when we can change our fist from closed to open, we can be more humble, more vulnerable, and reveal our thinking under our story. Does that ring?
Yeah. Yeah. Let's talk about standards.
Yeah.
In particular. How is a standard articulated in our minds?
So example, I've worked with women groups sometimes, and just for fun, and this isn't anything about dissing women or anything, but for fun, I would say, so how many people in the room, when they leave the house, if the beds aren't all made, they feel like they're not a good mom or a good housewife? And generally, a large proportion, majority of people in the room raise their hands. And I simply ask, so that's a standard. You have that standard. Where did you adopt that? So they adopted that standard from their mother, from their grandmother, from their auntie, or from a lesson they learned in school. Who knows? But they adopted that. And I'm not judging that standard, but I'm saying to have the standard and to investigate it and to decide consciously whether you want to keep it or not is where we get more. That's where freedom comes from. That's where I can say, you know what? I don't have to feel bad when I go to work because the beds aren't made. And so the standards are for men. We actually are probably taught not to show our emotions. That too is a standard. And so if we investigate that, we can see the benefits of finding ways to be emotionally intelligent and to productively and effectively share our emotions. And we can shift out of that sort of unconscious standard that we hold that might keep us back.
So in the example of the beds not being made, I suppose, can you walk us through a little bit more of the detail of how do we look at it? Because I imagine that's not a 2-minute operation. Hey, you know what? That's silly. I could, the beds don't need to be made and I'm still a great mom.
Yeah, exactly.
Glad I looked at that and that's now behind me.
Yeah.
I imagine there's a little bit more depth to it. What is happening there, Chuck?
Yeah. So, I mean, it can happen like that. I mean, there are people that go, whoa, that's a standard I didn't even know I had, because literally, I don't know, some large number, 90% of our standards, we did not consciously choose. We adopted them from our culture and family. So it can happen where someone goes, whoa, that standard, I don't need that. Now, that doesn't mean that it's going to switch overnight, because it's like we're messing around with neural networks in our brain, right? So, and that there's no switch to make it happen overnight. But slowly, with awareness, maybe the next time this happens, the woman thinks to herself, yeah, I feel a little guilty, but you know what? I'll make him when I get home. And then 2 weeks later, she does it again. She goes, oh, screw that. I'm fine. And 3 weeks later, she goes, I'm going to make the beds today because I have time. And so she has a totally different relationship with the standard. She can be conscious of or choose when she wants to apply it or not apply it. And I often say, you know, every time my clients say, well, I don't want to do this habit, or I don't want to do this, I want to change that standard. And I say, well, if I had a magic pill and you never did that again, would you pay me $10,000? And most of the time people say, sure. And I'd be a rich man. But there's no magic pill, right? So it's beginning to increase our awareness of what our patterns are, whether it's standards or some kind of ways that we emotionally react to things. Pay attention in a new way, and then begin a process of being consciously choosing how you want to shift that pattern.
That's a really good question there with regard to the magic pill, which reminds me of thinking about the book Feeling Great by David Burns, the sequel to Feeling Good. And that's, they ask a similar question about if I had a magic button where, you know, you'd never worry about this again. If you pressed it, often they say, well, no, I don't want to press it. There are times and places in which this reaction, standard, belief, story is of value to me, and just sort of severing it entirely is not ideal. And so that question in and of itself, it kind of segments or puts you down a fork path of potentially insightful exploration. Like, there's just no place for this at all. Versus, well, I mean, under these circumstances or with these nuances, it's great.
No, absolutely. And that's the being aware of and understanding the underbelly of the standard or the underbelly of the assumption or judgment, right? So you can make a more wise choice about how to apply or how not to apply. There are times when this gets into a little bit of the power issues. There are times you can be in business and someone might say to you that you did a terrible job. Depending on the hierarchy, depending on your relationship with that person, you might not give a damn about what they said. But the next day, someone else with more power or hierarchy or higher in the hierarchy says something and you trust them and you give their voice a lot of power. You care a lot about what they said. And that too is a choice point. But being aware of those differences makes us be able to be much smarter and wiser choices. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So we talked about story bits.
Yep.
Anything that you really want to make sure to put out there about collaborative conversations and how those can go better?
Yeah. So now if you think about storytelling, that's the primary, because that's where the book starts. And it's a good 50 pages at the beginning of the book, because we have to start with our own stuff. We have to just become more aware of our stories and more aware of how we show up in the world with them. Now we walk into a room and there's 2 people, you and I, or 5 people, or a meeting of 10 or 20 people. Now we have 20 people, 20 stories around the room, 20 different perspectives around the room. And when we are entering there with semi-closed fists or closed fists, there's a lot of friction and a lot of stress that's created because everyone's trying to up the other person. And I think the fundamental pattern that we have is we're educated to have the answer. We raise our hands to have the answer and get the gold star. But the fundamental pattern is that when we enter into collaboration, or let's just say we enter into conversations, we're not even aware of whether we're collaborating or not. We enter into conversations. We generally can enter in defensively because we want our answer to be right. And so the real art of the collaborative conversation is learning to not give up your position, but hold your position with an open hand and reveal the thinking underneath. Are there power issues? What are the desires you have? What are the concerns you have? What are the standards you're holding? And when we can be a little more vulnerable and open our hands that way, we are also inviting other people to do the same thing. So the collaborative conversation is the art of open advocacy and open inquiry. And open advocacy meaning open hand. And open inquiry means asking questions that you really want to better understand the other person's perspective, versus inquiry where you're asking questions to prove them wrong so you can be right. And so there's a dance there, and I can't say do this first, do this second. There's a dance of paying attention, and there's emotions, and there's body language, and it's this dance of opening and learning together. I call it mutual learning, where multiple perspectives can surface up. And because of that, there's space for ideas to bubble up. There's ways that I could say to you, oh gosh, I never thought of it that way. So that changes how I'm thinking about the problem.
And I'm curious, if you're not in the headspace of feeling curious, curious about being curious, you're not curious and you do think someone's wrong. Do you have any pro tips on how to just do a mental emotional redirect to get into a better headspace, groove, flow to have a higher quality conversation?
Yeah, I think, well, let's say just the best place to start is state what you know is to be real, to be true, to be factual, and see if you can find a bridge with the other person about this is what happened or this is what's happening. Because the facts are the safest ground we have to stand on in a collaborative conversation. Now, we know from politics that when that ground is shaky, it's just a friggin' nightmare. So if you can sort of calm yourself to go, okay, we don't agree. And before we actually start sharing our standards and things like that, what are the facts we agree on? We agree that I'm going back to the legal finance thing, that the company, the last 4 quarters have been pretty miserable, and we have to change things and we have to push our product in a different way or be more creative. Do we agree on the state of things? And that's a solid ground to work from. And then from there, we can start asking questions like, well, how do you think about X? And what do you think about the market share? And so that inquiry is how we learn what the underbelly of your judgment is or your disagreement is. Mm-hmm. Right? Because it's always going underneath to find out more, to think about your thinking or to reveal your thinking.
Okay. And I'm curious, in the course of having these conversations, are there any favorite or least favorite words or phrases that you think really open up cool things or shut it down real quick?
Well, I think most of the time what shuts things down is judgment. So someone will maybe put something out there and another person will rise up right away with, well, that'll never work. And that's why I shy away from the term brainstorming, because we all know what that means. But the downside of brainstorming is someone comes up with a crazy idea and someone else in the room goes, well, we tried that 5 years ago and it never worked. And that closes down the conversation. So this sort of gets us into the creative conversation, because if you and I are in a mutual learning conversation where I'm saying, wow, I never thought of it that way, and we're sort of coming to a way of having a mutual understanding, what happens is there's space in that conversation, there's space in our minds, and ideas start bubbling up. And together we might come up with an idea might bubble up that you didn't think of or I didn't think of independently. And we both go, whoa, yeah, that's the answer. Wow. And that's how the creative conversation functions. It only functions when all parties are willing to be in that open space, open mind, open heart space.
Okay. So we did that last year is not a great phrase in a creative conversation.
Yeah.
Any other phrases you love and phrases you don't?
So a phrase that's really useful is, help me understand your position. Please help me understand your thinking. What's your thinking under your thinking? That's a very inviting sort of phrase that tells the other person you're open to not criticizing, but to truly understanding. And your other question was what's some that aren't so helpful?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So the unhelpful are to, instead of asking questions, to stay in advocacy, what I call closed advocacy, where no matter what they say, your response is, yes, but I think blah, blah, blah. And so that's the closed advocacy where we can't undo that need to be right. So that's a real trap. And the distinction that I've learned from my teachers is the distinction of being a knower versus a learner. And so the bad side of the advocacy and inquiry and the collaborative conversation is to be stuck as a knower. And no matter what the other person does, even if they ask you a good question, you don't want to reveal your thinking. You don't want to open your hand. You just go, no, this is the way it is because this is my experience. And you're just stuck. You're sort of like a solid rock.
Gotcha. Okay. And can you tell us what are mindful agreements and how do we get there?
So there's a phrase that I have in the book, a little chapter around commitment conversations that I call the conversational bypass. And what I mean by that is we have storytelling and we have commitment conversations. Those are our favorite conversations. We like to tell our stories and we like to take action. The middle two conversations, collaborative and creative, take more effort, take a little more time, take a change in how we're showing up. And so what I say is because we love our stories and we're addicted to action, we leap from storytelling to action and we do a bypass. So an example might be we're in a meeting. There's a couple people that say, well, a leader, someone saying, here's what we're trying to solve. Here's the problem. A couple voices speak up. The loud extroverts speak up. The boss might say what his is. And then someone in the room or the boss or someone says, okay, what are we going to do? And so we make a leap to action and decision. And often those decisions aren't as vetted as they could be because we haven't listened to opposing perspectives. We haven't taken the time to come up with other possibilities. The creative conversation is about possibilities, what's possible. And so that bypass makes us make bad decisions. A good commitment conversation, a good promise, means both sides understand what's being asked, what's being promised, and what success looks like. So that conversation actually involves every time someone makes a request, will you do X, Y, and Z? Our tendency, our pattern as a culture is to default to yes. And when we default to yes, we don't take the time to get clarity and go, wait a minute, what am I really promising here? What's the timing? What's the conditions of satisfaction? Who's it for? What format do you want? Whatever the questions are, we miss that because we are sort of addicted to, sure, no problem, I can do that. And an example is, someone runs by your desk and says, can you put some numbers together for me for Monday morning? And you say, sure. You and your team spend the weekend putting a 30-page report together. Monday morning, the boss takes it, looks at the back page, which is a summary, rips the back page off. Perfect. This is just what I needed for my meeting. And there were, how many man hours were spent because they didn't take an extra 5 minutes to ask the question, listen, to help you with your meeting, I really want to understand what you really need.
Right.
And now with the rip of the last page, the boss goes off happy, unaware that 300 man hours were spent, and they're all frustrated, and they all now have a story about the boss.
Right.
So we're back to stories.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So we can do commitment conversations, just slow the process down a bit. If any request, make sure you have an understanding of what you're making a promise. And the other thing is to avoid the yes, don't make promises you can't keep. I mean, I can be asked to do something and maybe I'm not competent to do it. And I have to be willing to say, I need a week to learn how to do that, or I need help how to do that. So there's all kinds of ways that if we slow down the process, we might discover how we can make not a sloppy promise, but a better promise.
All right. Well, Chuck, any final thoughts before we shift gears and hear about some of your favorite things?
Yeah, I think, for me, this is a practice. I think learning about how conversations work, there's no switch, there's no magic pill. But as we look at the distinctions, it gives us a new lens. And be gentle on yourself. Don't judge yourself. Be curious about, well, what is my pattern and how can I change that pattern? And that change is sort of a slow process. It's like, it might change overnight, but it might take you a week. It might take you 2 weeks. But if you stay paying attention and patient with yourself and non-judgmental, you can change those patterns.
Okay. Well, now could you share with us a favorite quote, something you find inspiring?
Oh, well, one of my favorite spiritual teachers is Hafiz, who was pre-Rumi. And I love this quote. He says, even after all this time, the sun never says to the earth, you owe me. Look what happens with a love like that. It lights up the whole sky.
Okay. And a favorite study or experiment or bit of research?
Right now, I'm liking neuroscience, and I'm not a neuroscientist, so I don't go too deeply. But I think we're just on the brink of learning how the brain works and how the chemicals interact and the electrical impulses, this incredibly complex set of neurons, billions of neurons. And I think what it's doing is giving us a window into why we humans act the way we do, which takes a little bit of the sting out of some of our habits so that we can look at them more neutrally and with a little more compassion.
And could you share a favorite book?
It's a few years old, but I love Yuval Harari's book called Sapiens. I like it because he tells a different story about how we evolved and how our brains and our thinking evolved. And it is, again, it's a fresh look at how mythology got created in concert with how our brains developed. And so that we learn to tell myths so we can have bigger societies. And then we attach ourselves to those myths. Even money is a story and law is a story. And so it's a way of looking at the world so we aren't so attached to our particular perspective, but we learn a little more tolerance, and the world could use a fair amount of that right now.
Can you elaborate on how money and law is a story? Because I think to many, they think, well, those things are just ironclad.
Yeah, well, over time, money has evolved from a point where at some time in history, shells could be a form of trade, and metals or precious metals, even tulips at one point were the trade, were the way that we did trade and what had value. And so money is a story because we all agree that this piece of paper has value. The piece of paper has nothing. The value and the power only is in our agreement of its value. And that agreement is a story that we all adopt and live by.
Okay. And could you share a favorite tool? Something you use to be awesome at your job?
Well, I'd say meditation is a really important tool for self-awareness and learning to understand our minds. And at my age, yoga is really important. So I think mental and physical things like that help keep us awake and aware and able are really important things to pay attention to.
Okay. And is there a key nugget you share that really seems to connect and resonate with folks that quote it back to you often?
There's a visual in my book of a spiral. It's like a V shape, and think of a funnel, like you put a quarter in this funnel at a museum of science. And by the time the quarter gets to the bottom, it's spinning so fast you don't recognize it as a quarter. I use that visual to help people understand that when something triggers them, emotional trigger, an upsetting event, that generally what we do is we spiral down. And it's usually fear-based. There's some fear we have that has us spiraling down. And the opposite of the fear is love at the top. And I bring that up because that visual helps people when they do catch themselves triggered or spiraling. They go, okay, where am I on the funnel? And that stops the spin And then we can do some investigation into our thinking and into our emotions and stop spiraling down and maybe move ourselves up through that awareness.
All right. And if folks want to learn more or get in touch, where would you point them?
My website is chuckwisner.com. I believe they can download a free PDF of the introduction. I'm on Instagram, Chuck_Wisner, and LinkedIn, and I think Facebook is the same.
Okay. And do you have a final challenge or call to action for folks looking to be awesome at their jobs?
Yes, I'd say investigate your thinking, be kind to yourself, be tolerant, try to be less judgmental, and really practice opening your hand so you can have an open hand and an open heart, and also being aware that you have to protect yourself.
All right. Chuck, thank you. This has been a treat. I wish you many lovely conscious conversations.
Same to you.
I really love Chuck's perspective on storytelling, and that often the stories we tell ourselves limit what we're willing to take on. And the narrative frame, it just has such a dramatic impact, even though it's often invisible. Renee Rodriguez at episode 773 had some similar points that this storytelling stuff is powerful, not only for your audiences, but for you. Great stuff from Chuck. Again, the show notes, the transcript, and the links to ads that we've referenced are found at awesomeatyourjob.com/EP910. Hope to catch you next time, and peace.
Thanks for listening. To get the most out of the show, we recommend 2 key things. First, check out the extra resources at awesomeatyourjob.com. You can find this episode's transcript and links, as well as the perfect episode for your situation. You can search the full text transcripts of hundreds of episodes or explore episodes tagged by topic and competency covered. Second, subscribe to the podcast and get future episodes automatically. You can subscribe by telling Siri and several other smartphones and speakers, subscribe to the How to Be Awesome at Your Job podcast, or by tapping subscribe in your podcast player of choice. If you'd like some extra help figuring out podcasts and how subscriptions work, visit awesomeatyourjob.com/subscribe for guidance. Hope to catch you on the next episode of How to Be Awesome at Your Job.